Namaskara. Namostu Ramaya Lakshmanaya Devyai Chatasai Janakatmajayai. Namostu Rudra Indra Yamanilebhyo. Namostu Chandrarka Marudganebhyaha. Welcome to the second session of the 6th week in our course on sense of past towards realizing Rama Rājya. There is a point that we started in the course in the previous session, which was to address the key question of what it means to talk of Sanatanata, and the theme for the week being Sanatana as Nitya Nutana. So if you recall, I mentioned that Sanatana and Nitya, these both are synonyms. Then the key question to ask is Sanatana as Nitya Nutana, where does the Nutana fit in? That is a key question that requires addressing. And we began that process by pointing to a couple of shlokas that are from the Mahabharata Shanti Parva 57th Adhyaya, in which Bhishmacharya is responding to Yudhishthira's questions, and he points out what is it that is the Sanatana Dharma meant for a Raja. And the shloka that I brought to your attention stated, Chaturvarnyasya dharmascha rakshitavya mahikshita dharma sankara rakshahi rāgyam dharmaha sanatanaha. The key point in here is there is a responsibility and also the duty that is accorded to a Raja to ensure that Dharma is protected from any sense of Sankarya. And we focused a bit on the question of the sense of Sankarya, and I have tried to bring to your attention that Sankarya is a well-defined notion, and we also have the proper analysis based on Sankarya when it comes to the question of contrasting between a universal and a pseudo-universal, a jati, samanya, and an upadhi. So this contrast is what I pointed to you is a very important distinction which has been quite rigorously developed in the works of Nayayikas, and I referred to Udayanacharya's reference to Jati Badhakas for an upadhi to become a jati. So this was the brief that we tried to speak of yesterday, and in the process I also brought to your attention another shloka from the same 57th Adhyaya of Mahabharata, where to speak of what kind of a Rājya, what kind of a kingdom, what kind of a polity has Sanatana Dharma, which is in practice, there is a measure that is given by Bhishmacharya, and that shloka went, Nayasya Kuta Kapatam Namaya Nacha Matsaraha Vishiye Bhumi Palasya Tasya Dharma Sanatanaha. So this I mentioned is a very fine kind of a condition, the satisfaction of which can give us a clarity in terms of whether we are indeed residing in a polity which is governed by Sanatana Dharma. And further, the point also is that there is a connection between Chaturvarnya and this sense that is actually pointed out. And this is something that we haven't focused on in our discussions yesterday, because continuing from the previous sessions, we have focused on Dr. Ambedkar's specific kind of analysis of Chaturvarnya as part of his famous undelivered speech, the Annihilation of Caste. So this Annihilation of Caste text is something that has at least 4 to 5 chapters which exclusively try to understand whether Chaturvarnya as an ideal can at all be brought to practice in modern times. Possibly say in terms of the looking at Chaturvarnya in modern lens, there is probably nobody who has seen it in the light and in the kind of rationale that Dr. Ambedkar has seen. And he did pose quite a number of questions, and of which one of the first things that he points out is that the very understanding of Chaturvarnya, as has been spoken of by the reformers of the Hindu religion, including Arya Samajis, they have specifically spoken of Chaturvarnya as something that has got nothing to do with a sense of jati, and the sense of jati, not just in the sense of the universal, but also that which is to do with the nature of birth of a person. So that varna is not decided based on birth, but based on worth, is a kind of formulation that Arya Samajis have put forth. And such a kind of a formulation is something that Dr. Ambedkar indeed tries to consider with sufficient kind of rigorous analysis. And he poses a question that such a kind of thing cannot actually address the diversity that has come in the form of what we today understand as caste. And I have already pointed out to you that caste, as understood by Dr. Ambedkar, has specifically got to do with the sense of marital relations. And he defines caste, and which is probably the way in which, say, it ought to be defined it in such a kind of a language, that caste is something that gets formed on account of endogamy and exogamy of certain particular kinds. So there is exogamy with respect to gotra and endogamy with respect to varna. So such a kind of marital structure is what leads to caste, as we understand, was the formulation that Dr. Ambedkar provides us with. And it's a very fine kind of a formulation. So the point to be noticed is that Dr. Ambedkar analyzes in his great, say, analysis about how at all this formulation can be realized, keeping, of course, the kind of values that he believes are very important in any kind of a modern polity, that is liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. So without such a kind of a sense of these values, he wouldn't reckon the sense of society to have any sense of ideal nature in it. So he is quite happy to admit that the possible imagination of Chaturvarnya could be an utopia, but that utopia does not stand to reason, because the kind of formulation that one gets to see with respect to the best formulation of Chaturvarnya in practice is the famous Rama Rājya. And he states that Chaturvarnya cannot ever sustain on its own without the sense of an active ruler who reins in the sense of the society by virtue of his coercive power. So I think it is appropriate to specifically read this section on Rama Rājya that Dr. Ambedkar speaks of. I'll certainly share the screen with you. And before that, I have actually, I wanted to bring to your attention that we did discuss this point in our previous week, because that is something that necessarily has to be addressed in any course that deals with the question of Rama Rājya. So let us take a look at the specific section. So this is the 16th chapter on as part of the Annihilation of Caste. I hope you are able to see the screen. You can notice that there are 26, chapters in the entire text of the Annihilation of Caste. And the annihilation of caste is found to be necessary because, as the titles indicate, I just read out, say, from the chapter 8 onwards. Caste prevents the uplift and incorporation of the aboriginal tribes. The higher castes have conspired to keep the lower castes oppressed down. Caste prevents Hinduism from being a missionary religion. Caste deprives Hindus of mutual help, trust, and fellow feeling. Caste is a powerful weapon for preventing all kinds of reform. Caste destroys public spirit, public opinion, public charity. So his ideal of a society is based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, which are the ideals which are also part of the Constitution of India, which is very important. Why I say this text must indeed be studied with sufficient kind of attention. Then he goes on to take to critically analyze whether Chaturvarnya can at all make any meaningful sense. And his analysis begins by pointing out the reformists, Arya Samaj's Chaturvarnya retains the old bad caste labels, that is Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra. These labels themselves carry certain kind of weight in society because those are carried forward. That indeed creates a problem in a society which still has, in the understanding of Dr. Ambedkar, a fallout of whatever are the memories that are still present. And this is the Chaturvarnya would face impossible difficulties in practice. And Chaturvarnya would be the most vicious system for the Shudras. Chaturvarnya is nothing new. It is as old as the Vedas and so on. So these are the points. And he goes on to point out that the real key to destroying caste is rejection of the Shastras. So we have also seen this formulation. So now take a look at the reason why I actually had to bring to your attention the question of universals as understood by Nayayikas. This because I'm actually referring to the second difficulty. You can go through the entire text. We can have a separate discussion on this if any of you is interested. There is a second difficulty which the protagonists of Chaturvarnya must grapple with if they wish to make the establishment of Chaturvarnya a success. Chaturvarnya presupposes that you can classify people into 4 definite classes. Is this possible? In this respect, the ideal of Chaturvarnya has, as you will see, a close affinity to the Platonic ideal. So Plato has spoken of 2 realms, the realm of ideas and the realm of reality. And the realm of ideas, when it actually becomes, you could say, profane, then come the real. So there's a distinction between Plato's ideal and the real. And the connection between ideal and real is not something that Plato ever explained in any of his writings. So to Plato, men fell by nature into 3 classes. In some individuals, he believed mere appetites dominated. He assigned them to the laboring and trading classes. Others revealed to him that over and above appetites, they had a courageous disposition. He classed them as defenders in war and guardians of internal peace. Others showed a capacity to grasp the universal reason underlying things. He made them the lawgivers of the people. So Dr. Ambedkar, by classifying the sense of Varna as universal and the possibility of Chaturvarnya as indicative of an ideal system, contrasts it with Plato's ideal and whatever are the criticism that one finds of Plato's Republic. Republic is a work of Plato, where the work of Plato is criticized by Aristotle's politics. So that brings into the question the kind of lens through which Dr. Ambedkar is reading it. So he makes an assertion that the criticism to which Plato's Republic is subject is also the criticism which must apply to the system of Chaturvarnya, insofar as it proceeds upon the possibility of an accurate classification of men into 4 distinct classes. The chief criticism against Plato is that his idea of lumping individuals into few sharply marked off classes is a very superficial view of man and his powers. Plato had no perception of the uniqueness of every individual, of his incommensurability with others, of each individual as forming a class of his own. He had no recognition of the infinite diversity of active tendencies and the combination of tendencies of which an individual is capable. To him, there were types of faculties or powers in the individual constitution. And all this is demonstrably wrong. Modern science has shown that the lumping together of individuals into a few sharply marked off classes is a superficial view of man, not worthy of serious consideration. So Chaturvarnya must fail for the very reason for which Plato's Republic must fail, namely that it is not possible to pigeonhole men according as they belong to one class or the other. That it is impossible to accurately classify people into 4 definite classes is proved by the fact that the original 4 classes have now become 4,000 castes. So I have brought to your attention that this classification of the Varna into 4,000 castes, in fact, these 4,000 castes are based on what are found on record in the schedule that was created in 1931. So if you may have observed newspapers, you would notice that whatever are the caste reservations that are actually given in our current polity, they are also dependent on the kind of caste census which was taken in 1931. So post that, we do not find, say, another caste census that was taken in the same spirit as it happened in the British times. And one would notice that, say, there was indeed a great kind of effort made that the kind of aggregation that happened based on the kind of census exercise that happened during the British times, that aggregation be disaggregated by doing a proper caste census, and such a kind of a view was put forth, including in the book Castes of Mind that Professor Nicholas Dirks has written, which I also referred to in a previous session. So whether the 2021 census would indeed go further and take that up is something that we are not yet sure. But my my understanding is that one wouldn't possibly want to open that up because that would indeed mean that, say, the sense of diversity that is there must be fully confronted. And that itself is something that is not in the current scope of memory of our people. So if it is indeed the case that 4 classes have become 4,000 castes, how have they become and what are these 4 classes? These are points which indeed say, Dr. Ambedkar says are impractical in its nature. And he also says, Chaturvarnya cannot subsist by its own inherent goodness. It must be enforced by law. So please notice these arguments. Chaturvarnya cannot subsist by its own inherent goodness. It must be enforced by law. And that without penal sanction, the ideal of Chaturvarnya cannot be realized is proved by the story in the Ramayana of Rama killing Shambhuka. Some people seem to blame Rama because he wantonly and without reason killed Shambhuka. But to blame Rama for killing Shambhuka is to misunderstand the whole situation. Ram Raj was a Raj based on Chaturvarnya. And as a king, Rama was bound to maintain Chaturvarnya. It was his duty, therefore, to kill Shambhuka, the Shudra, who had transgressed his class and wanted to be a Brahmin. This is a reading of Dr. Ambedkar, which is not something that will indeed be valid with respect to what we find in the Uttarakanda of Ramayana, or even in any other reference that one finds. So the point was not about, say, the Shudra had transgressed his class and wanted to be a Brahmin that actually resulted in Shambhuka Vadha, as we have actually gone on to see the kind of ritual that Shambhuka performs. That ritual is something that, a similar kind of a ritual was something that even Trishanku, one of the ancestors of Rama, wanted to perform, and for which he was cursed to become a Chandala, who is the only kind of a person who is spoken of as an Asprasya by Manusmriti. So do keep this in mind. Let me continue with Dr. Ambedkar's analysis. This is the reason why Rama killed Shambhuka. Rama killed Shambhuka because the story, as we have recounted, the performance of this Ashastriya Yajna by Shambhuka resulted in the premature death of a 5-year-old young boy who was a son of a Brahmana. And as we have repeatedly noted, the key point of Rama Rājya is that one would not find premature deaths in Rama Rājya. That is a very important measure, which is beyond the scope of whatever is the temporal understanding of the nature of polity that we find in terms of the theories of polity that we find today. So the point of, apart from, of course, the Sanatana Dharma measure, which I just read out from Bhishma Acharya's reference to no Matsarya, no Maya, no Kapata, so no Kutaniti. So that kind of a formulation and this sense of no premature death, they would indeed be something which are in sync and not out of sync if one properly analyzes. So that is a thing that we could take a look at a little later. But now let us continue with the analysis. So this is the reason why Rama killed Shambhuka, but this also shows that penal sanction is necessary for the maintenance of Chaturvarnya. Not only penal sanction is necessary, but the penalty of death is necessary. That is why Rama did not inflict on Shambhuka a lesser punishment. That is why the Manusmriti prescribes such heavy sentences as cutting off the tongue or pouring of molten lead in the ears of the Shudra who recites or hears the Veda. The supporters of Chaturvarnya must give an assurance that they could successfully classify men and that they could induce modern society in the 20th century to reinforce the penal sanctions of the Manusmriti. So a key point in this context that, I think I should read out the next paragraph also, because all these are very important in terms of the question of Sanatanatha, which is indeed referred to when one speaks of Chaturvarnya, as Bhishmacharya has spoken of. So the protagonists of Chaturvarnya do not seem to have considered what is to happen to women in their system. Are they also to be divided into 4 classes, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra? Or are they to be allowed to take the status of their husbands? If the status of the woman is to be the consequence of marriage, what becomes of the underlying principles of the Chaturvarnya? Namely, that the status of a person should be based upon the worth of that person, because this entire analysis is based on Aryasamaji's contention that Chaturvarnya is not based on birth, but it is to be considered based on worth. So if they are to be classified according to their worth, is their classification to be nominal or real? The very fact of nominality or reality about it is very important, because the sense of nominal is to say that what exists in reality are only names. There is nothing ontologically true about it. If you say something is real, it means that, say, not only is the naming real, but there indeed exists something ontologically present. So the entire argument is actually structured in the context of philosophical analysis of whether Chaturvarnya can indeed be a system which can be brought forth into practice as on today. So I think I'd stop reading this part here. Let me get to the question of Rama Rājya, as has been specifically addressed by Dr. Ambedkar, where his reference to Chaturvarnya as an impractical system, and whether a system which does not have inherent goodness in it, whether it can indeed be an ideal form of a society. So first point to be asked in this formulation is the term society. When we speak of the term society, there is a context to the word society that comes. And in India, the nature of Indian society does include the point of having Varnashrama Dharma. So the historical unfolding of how we understand the term society and various sociological theories that have actually gone beyond in terms of understanding what a society is. And these things have never actually had a notion of Varnashrama Dharma. So to speak of Indian, what exists around us as the Indian society, and whether it can indeed be something that can be separated from the sense of polity, is a question of the nature of translation that one does for the question of Chaturvarnya. That Varnashrama Dharma should actually be translated as a social polity is a formulation that I did find some thinking sociologists of India have tried to see in what manner can we indeed speak of the Indian experience, because the words in English do not seem to capture the exact nature of how to describe what is found. So when our description is in terms of the nature of society as understood in the sociological theories that are available from the European context, then they indeed do not serve to help us understand what is the formulation of the Indian society, which apart from many things also has Varnashrama Dharma and has this unique kind of a marital structure which goes by the name caste system. So one indeed has to be in a position to speak of these aspects if one were to have a theory that indeed describes it appropriately. So while this is one important question, I think it is also meaningful to bring to your attention that for the English word society, if one looks at the Indian terms which are used in our own languages, whether it be in Hindi or Kannada, Telugu, or any of the Indian languages, one does indeed find a term called Samaja that has become quite popular. So Bharatiya Samaja is supposed to mean Indian society. So if one looks at the term Samaja in terms of the historical antecedents of the usage of the term Samaja in our own languages, then one would indeed find a case where Samaja is referred to as a Nataka Samaja. So we do not find instances of Samaja being spoken of in the English sense of the term society, though of course in terms of our current formulation, if one has to speak of society, we speak of Samaja in our language. And whenever Samaja is meant in our own languages today, it does not mean, say, the original sense of the etymological meaning of Samaja that is formulated in our tradition, but it is supposed to mean the meaning that the English word society gives. So that is a very important observation that I think needs to be brought to your attention. And I was very fortunate to notice this kind of observation made by Professor Viśvaprasanna Pathak, whose words I have actually included in the course background note. So Professor Pathak actually makes a very insightful remark that if at all we do not have a term to explain our own, explain or describe our own state of affairs where we are in, then how can we actually expect somebody else to understand what we are about? So that way, the self-description that is currently made possible is something that is highly inadequate, and therefore we indeed require fresh theorizations which can possibly have the ability to describe what we are experiencing, because we aren't yet in a state of affairs where the existing theories, whether they be of theories of yore or theories of contemporary theories which are prepared elsewhere, they seem to be satisfactorily explaining our own condition. So that's an intellectual task which indeed has to be taken up, and that is indeed a kind of a direction from where we can speak of Swarajyan ideas. So I do want this to be kept in mind. So when it comes to the question of Chaturvarnya, is it the case that Chaturvarnya, by the traditional spokespersons of Chaturvarnya, do they have these kind of questions that Dr. Ambedkar poses? It is very interesting to find that it is not just in terms of the current formulation, but even if I go back to, say, the supposedly the golden period of the past 1,000 years, specifically in the south, when it comes to the reign of Vijayanagara Empire, we find Samskrita Kavyas written by Sri Krishna Devaraya, or even say the ones that praise the best of the rulers of Vijayanagara Empire. They actually state that here are those kind of rulers who have re-established Chaturvarnya and Varnashrama Dharma, when it is indeed known to us today that whatever is the diversity in terms of the number of jatis and kulas that were present during the Vijayanagara Empire were much more than the 4,000 castes which have been aggregated and put up in the schedule by the British. So in spite of, say, having this vivid diversity which with the conscious knowledge of which was with the poets of yore of the Vijayanagara Empire, when it comes to the description of how well was the rule, they follow the same template of the description that one finds in Mahabharata or even in the Ramayana, and they refer to Chaturvarnya, and the Varnashrama Dharmas were actually in vogue. So that clearly puts a question that whether, say, the analysis that Dr. Ambedkar does, it actually tries to see how is it that this diversity and these four varnas are reconciled, or in fact they are understood. So where exactly would be the kind of possibility for this diversity to to arise? So one other point that also needs to be noted is also that when one speaks of liberty, equality, and fraternity, there is indeed a claim that one makes to the nature of the relation between state and a citizen, which has to provide for a Bill of Rights, or say the rights of man. And the entire exercise of a modern polity is to ensure that the state's influence on the individual citizen is something that is not coercive, and it must allow for the citizen to have enough kinds of protections which are granted by the sovereign authority, that even the sovereign cannot override them. And it is in that context that we have in majority of the world polities the reference to fundamental rights. Now, all these fundamental rights, if one were to look at it in terms of a critical understanding of the theory of rights, then we should indeed say that every right would actually come with a corresponding duty associated with it. There is no possibility of trying to state that a right and a duty are not connected. So if at all such a kind of a thing happens in practice or in theory, there is an imbalance in the formulation itself. We can easily say, verify that with a thought experiment. If indeed there is freedom of speech and that is granted to every citizen, unless and until, say, the person who is in power, who may as well be a citizen, if he does not actually have the duty to ensure that that freedom of speech that is exercised by the other is respected, of course, within the kind of bounds of decency that one expects in terms of society, which has certain kind of a measure of what is appropriate and what is not. Because every society has a sense of past, and it has its own memory in terms of what it considers as appropriate and what it considers as inappropriate. And even as say there are conscious attempts made by people to alter those kinds of values that are present within the society. So the sense of this right and a duty having, say, a complementary role is something that one must indeed keep in mind when one actually comes to the question of trying to talk of the enforcement by someone who is in position of power. So even if, say, there is this society which has these ideals such as liberty, equality, and fraternity that are spoken of, that cannot possibly be achieved without an enforcement by the authority which is in power. So let me read out that specific section where, say, the point of the law and the sanction of the law is referred to. Chaturvarnya cannot subsist by its own inherent goodness. It must be enforced by law. And that without penal sanction, the ideal of Chaturvarnya cannot be realized is proved by the story, is how, say, Rāma Rājya's reference is brought in the text of the Annihilation of Caste by Dr. Ambedkar. So, question of whether, say, the whether liberty, equality, and fraternity, in terms of the inherent goodness that it conveys, it is something that can at all be realized without enforcement, is one question that indeed must be asked. So the response that Dr. Ambedkar gives is, I agree and I admit that, say, without the enforcement by law, one cannot possibly realize the spirit of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So in that sense, enforcement by law is indeed important. But when it comes to Chaturvarnya, it is actually trying to describe society as it exists, and it does not even seem to have any sense of utopia associated with it. Why would one have to leave aside an utopia which immediately, when one listens to it, it gives a sense of attractiveness? Why should that be left out for the sake of a particular notion of Chaturvarnya, which seems to be something that is in a great degree of rusted sense, where, say, there is no sense of active thinking about Chaturvarnya? When such a thing is not existent, why should one consider that as an ideal? What seems to be something that one finds in, say, texts like that of Manusmriti is as good as saying that it is seemed to be a description of what happens. It does not seem to have an ideal. So this is Dr. Ambedkar's, say, critique, where he points out that the sense of Chaturvarnya is something that cannot serve the purpose of an ideal, or the kind of a sense where one would speak of that sense where everybody follows their respective dharma is something that is an ideal that is to be, say, sought after, because his point would be that the sense by which, say, in fact, that's the other section where he speaks about the way in which Shudras would be completely, say, considered to be oppressed through and through, because it is the most vicious system for the Shudras. So such is the kind of critique based on, again, say, the contemporary kind of analysis of the society that Dr. Ambedkar has made. And of course, there is a clear sense by which he has formulated this critique by also trying to consider the conditions under which one can imagine Chaturvarnya to be indeed meaningful. Now, this poses a separate question, because there's also the other point that is asked, and that other point turns out to be the key point about how at all can one speak of those who do not have any kind of sense of Varna in mind. See, one reason why he did not take the analysis of Varna by birth seriously is because it cannot be applied to the entire world, where many people outside of India and many people within India also do not have any sense of what Varna they belong to. So at least in the 1950s, there were certain memories which are present. For example, say Sir Muhammad Iqbal used to state quite openly that he is a descendant of Kashmiri Pandits. So he had that memory in him. So he said that I'm a Brahmin, and since Varna is got nothing to do with, say, the religion that I belong to, so he had that clarity in his mind. But that kind of a thing would not be there for those people who are actually in Europe, settled in America or in Africa. So the system is something that cannot be something that can claim itself to have transposition to different parts of the world. It doesn't seem to have that kind of a wherewithal to be a system that indeed has a force of the rational argument, for it to be presented as a polity that requires to be thought of. But if one actually tries to look at this argument carefully, one would indeed notice that the effort that is made in this argument is to consider that the formulation of Chaturvarnya is without any kind of a subsequent commentaries which would try to adapt to the nature of situations that one is present in, and it is rather taking a snapshot of a past which is in silos, or that which is indeed in a state of slumber, or you could even say static. So if one indeed cares for, say, any type of a tradition actually survives the vicissitudes of time because it has dynamism in it. And that dynamism is what I want to bring to your attention when the theme of Sanatana as Nitya Nutana is being referred to. Even as Sanatana synonymously also means Nitya, which is permanent, which is Shashvata. The Nutanata comes with the conscious understanding of what would be its dynamic interpretation in the present times that one lives in. So Sanatana as Nitya Nutana calls for that clarity as to how one can indeed make an effort to try and understand the sense of this structure of Chaturvarnya. And you do find that there are people, like for example, say Pandit Nehru had this clarity that Chaturvarnya needs to be taken in terms of, say, the kind of roles that are to be understood, which are performed by the Brahmanas, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas and Shudras. So how is this understood? So in instances, for example, if we indeed have a police force or a military, they are performing the role of protection. So that is the role of a Kshatriya. Similarly, if you have businessmen who are traders, who are into agriculture, who are into cattle rearing, all these are to be treated as Vaishyas. So this is a clarity that Pandit Nehru did have. So how is it that you are actually trying to understand this, and how does one take this and also apply it with respect to such kind of people who might indeed have a memory that they belong to which Varna that they are born into. So there is that memory which is present in some people, and there are memories which are not present in some people, and there are memories which are completely erased in such instances where there may have been, say, conversions into another religion, or there is no memory of conversion that one has in the past so many generations, whose conscious memory is still present in the families of different people. So there are people who would point out that Chaturvarnya and the kind of roles that are played by Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra, these roles require indeed to be replicated for any type of a society across the world for it to have a meaningful kind of existence. If it indeed is, say, able to perform things, then such a kind of a formulation comes about only because there are, say, alternate ways by which these four varnas have been instituted by the people. The people who are, say, consciously thinking of it or even unconsciously, they recognize these roles and thereby end up with, say, performing the corresponding roles that each is supposed to play. That is to say, in such instances where there is memory, the call that one finds in terms of what is dharma is to ensure that the people indeed live by whatever is their swadharma, which is something that is ordained with respect to each of these varnas, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya and Shudra. Then the question comes, in what manner can this be understood for those who do not have this memory? So one way is that there is a conscious way in which one makes an effort to try and analyze this, the kind of work that one does, and then attribute to oneself what kind of a person, what kind of a varna that he or she belongs to. Now, this does not seem to be something which has a great potential in terms of theorizing. It leaves it to individuals. It does not seem to have any sense of categorical principle that one can actually look for. So, one way that people have tried to classify it, of course, is by virtue of, say, the kind of identification of the activities that are taken up by each of these people. So, each of these groups of people belonging to various varnas. So, he who is involving himself into an activity that is to do with study and education ought to be treated as a Brahmana. One who is involved with protection is to be treated protection from external or internal enemies with respect to a state is to be treated as a Kshatriya. One who is into trade of any kind is a Vaishya. And for these three to actually have their own corresponding space and comfortable kind of life for them to pursue with their activities, you require a number of people who will have to provide for such services which would enable these activities to continue. So one indeed requires a number of tools. So the makers of tools have always been Shudras. So in that sense, when one refers to, say, man as a tool-making animal, man as a homo faber, it perfectly fits the description of a Shudra as understood in the Chaturvarnya. So the key point to be noticed is that this tool making is a huge exercise, and that indeed is something that is very diverse also. So whether it be in terms of the kind of activities that are relating to education, or with respect to the kind of protection activities that one does, or with respect to the kind of trade activities that one does, one requires tools, one requires products, and these production and these activities are the ones that you find the entire class of people in the Shudras. They are the ones who are taking it up. And that way speaking, say, a majority of human activity possibly falls into the activities of Shudras also. So this is one formulation. But then there is another formulation that I intend to bring to your attention, and this is something that also sits well with the kind of formulation that the modern democratic polity itself bases itself on. So we have already discussed the question of sovereignty in a modern polity, for example, like that of India, where President of India is the head of the state, and the individuals who are sovereign, when they happen to vote, they transfer a part of their sovereignty, and all the parts of the sovereignty which have been, say, transferred to the candidate to who, say, the individual has voted, they are coalesced and they actually aggregate themselves to form a power center, and that power center is the President of India, who is the head of the state. And from him is the power again further devolving into the legislature, executive, and judiciary, is what we have actually discussed. Let me go a step further. The point is the nature of sovereignty that is present with the individual when he is voting for somebody and saying, you are going to be my representative in the parliament. So he is transferring a part of his sovereignty onto somebody else. That is to say, by doing so, whatever is the member of parliament or a member of legislative assembly, he is speaking for me because I have authorized him to do so. Such is the kind of formulation in which the democratic polity functions. So there is indeed a case where the nature of decisions and the kind of actions that human beings perform, they are always, in fact, they can be classified into such kind of actions which are performed by the individual by conscious knowledge of all things that are involved, and also takes a decision, the full responsibility of which is taken by the individual. If one notices our own life, we find that such kind of instances are very few. For example, let's say you go to a shopkeeper and you want to buy a soap, bath soap. So when you go to the shopkeeper, you go and ask for the soap, and the person might as well say, so if you ask for a Mysore sandal soap, the person would give you the soap, and he might charge you the MRP, maximum retail price, or he might as well say reduce the cost of it and give it to you at some cost. So who is actually the one who is deciding what is the price of this soap? One, of course, the company, the factory which is producing Mysore sandal soaps. The other, of course, is the shopkeeper who is deciding what is profitable to him while selling it. One would not go and say that, you see, this can be sold at a much lesser price, and you are actually cheating me by giving me this, this soap at a cost of 40 rupees or so. So one would never actually get into that kind of a debate. What is happening inherently in here is that one is transferring the responsibility as well as the authority to decide the price to the other. It's not the case that the decision is being taken by the individual himself or herself. There are a number of such decisions that one takes every now and then, where those decisions that one follows are not the ones that one indeed takes for oneself, but it is actually following somebody else who has decided for you with respect to that particular aspect. I repeat, when it comes to the human actions, and there are whole number of actions that one indeed can notice that one performs. These variety of actions, each of them involves a certain degree of one's own conscious involvement in making a decision, and there are many others where one suspends our own judgment and allows somebody else to judge, adjudicate, and take a decision. So, if one makes a classification of all these activities that one does, there is a theory that our late Professor Navjyoti Singh has formulated, where he says that there can only be 4 such kind of instances that one can classify all these activities into. And he would say that the Chaturvarnya is to be understood in such a formulation. So when it comes to a question of what needs to be learned, it cannot be a democratic process where a child goes, or say a set of children say that the syllabus must be this, because the children are ignorant and the person who is instructing is the person who is to who the decision of what needs to be taught must be handed over by the children, without which there is no possible education at all ever happening. So this is not just in terms of this instance. For example, if it comes to protection, one might indeed try to say protect oneself, but there are many a times, for example, you sit in a vehicle and you are not the driver. You have transferred the protection of your own life to the person who is riding, who is the driver in the vehicle. So at that moment in time, if the driver is ending up creating an accident, then you may not be alive also. So here there's a transfer of the protection of your own life which has been transferred to the driver. And one might say that the traffic police is supposedly to ensure that whoever are these drivers around, they are the ones who are following a law so that any kind of a mishap does not happen. So I can actually point you to a variety of these instances, and the claim that is being made is that whenever there is a transfer of one's own adjudicative ability for somebody else to hold on to a certain kind of a decision that is made for my sake, then there is indeed a transfer of what is my individual power onto someone else. And when this is done, not just by a single individual, but by a large number of people, then this transfer of power accumulates, and it is something that coalesces together, and it can be aggregated to form one kind of a power. So Professor Navjyoti used to call that Chaturvarnya are power towers. There's a power tower which is with respect to the protection from external as well as internal dangers, which is that which has been given the name Kshatriya. Kshetra itself is about the way in which one protects by fighting. So the key point to be noticed is that in terms of the human ontological functions that one can ever think of, all of them can be classified within these 4 power towers, is the claim. Now, if this is the formulation, in such instances where there is memory which is prevalent for the people, to follow the Gita-charya's reference, Swadharme Nidhanam Sreyaha Paradharmo Bhayavaha, what it calls for is a rigorous discipline which one embraces to ensure that what one does as action, is as a deed, is something that is aligned with what is one's ordained duty. And in such instances where such a thing does not happen, where we do not have, say, this memory indeed present, we always have the vikalpa, the alternates which are created, which are indeed the way in which the society functions. So across the world, when it comes to, say, the memories of it, which are, say, present in a large number of people, even to this day, about which kind of varna that one belongs to, or which kind of, forget about the sense of varna, which kind of jati and the kind of kula that one belongs to, and there are memories of the same which are still prevalent. For one to be true to them is something which is a simple enough, say, suggestion. And for those who have forgotten, if it is indeed possible for them to reclaim that memory, then that is also something that should be open for people to, say, work out. And if that also does not happen, then one would have to look at, say, the kind of guna, the kind of values and the kind of worth that is actually suggested. And such a kind of a formulation, when brought to the question of, say, which are the kind of things that you are ready to suspend, there are inclinations that one can possibly claim that people have with respect to, say, their ontological formulations, that I would, for example, a Kshatriya would never ever have a kind of, in fact, it is Sanatana Dharma for a Kshatriya not to ever beg from somebody else. The entire reason why Mahabharata war happened is because of this particular question of Swadharma. And all that, say, the Krishna Rayabhara that did was ask for 5 villages from which are actually legitimately to be inherited by Pandavas, because if they have them, they can as well rule over them, and by protecting people and collecting taxes from them, they can have their own livelihood. But for them to actually take up any other task as a regular kind of a thing is something that their own personal swabhava would consider it to be utterly infeasible, and that is something that they would not actually, say, ever want to do. So there are people who one might indeed find, say, with such characteristics. And it is also important to notice that when one refers to questions of swabhava and swadharma, these do not actually refer to qualities that are gross in their nature, and they are very subtle in their formulations. It is to do with, say, the kind of, if one were to recognize that, one may have to keenly observe one's own actions that one may have performed right since their childhood, and try to make an appropriate analysis to recognize where exactly are the kind of choices that are made by one, where they are ready to forego what type of decisions that they would let others take, and what would be those kind of decisions that one takes for oneself and also for the sake of others. So this kind of a formulation is a fascinating kind of a suggestion, which I think is very important to start recognizing. In what sense can one think of Nitya Nutanata, Sanatana as Nitya Nutana? There is a second point that I want to bring to your attention in the context of universals, that, and this is again an insight which I gained from Professor Navjyoti Singh, and this is the manner in which he critiques the sense of modernity and the kind of values that we have sought after from modernity, and the kind of things that we have gained from modernity over time, which are considered as universal, but they may not be so. In an earlier session, I referred to this famous Mullah Nasiruddin's story, where Mullah is searching under a street light, and passers-by, because Mullah Nasruddin is very famous, they wanted to help him, and they asked, "What is it that you're looking for?" Then the passers-by said that, "I'm looking for a lost key." So everybody started searching around the place, and this streetlight being in the crossroads, people from all the four sides, they also came to assist Mullah Nasruddin, and they found in no time that nowhere in the vicinity could they find the lost key. So then they went up to Nasruddin and asked, "Mullah, tell us, where exactly did you lose the key?" So then Mullah said, "You see, there is a wall, and beyond that wall there is darkness. It is there that I lost my key." Then everybody naturally asked, "Why is it that you're searching here? You should be searching there, where you lost it." But Mullah very pointedly asked, "But you see, light is here, there is no light there. So I am actually searching at that place where light is." So there are many ways in which this particular story can be understood. And one of the things that Professor Navjyoti Singh has pointedly brought to attention is that which is seen as light, in which, say, our own lost sense of past with respect to many things that are probably still being followed by us, but whose rationale we do not know, it has got to do with an erasure of memories, which has specifically come about because the nature of light that actually is offered to us is not the sense of light which can capture our own, say, understanding of past. So when it comes to modern European Enlightenment, there have been several very wonderful critiques that one can get to notice amongst the European scholars, and amongst them, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century Common Era, Martin Heidegger, has written a remarkable critique where he has tried to analyze the entire formulation of the Western thought by focusing on the analysis of the verb to be and the various be forms. If one recalls the English classes that when we have in our childhood, when English was being taught, find that, say, the English teacher would spend a great degree of time to speak of be forms: is, are, were, was, and so on. So the be forms are considered as very important in terms of understanding the nature of one's own being. And Martin Heidegger has written a work where he said being in English may not capture, say, the kind of force of the thing that I intend to say, which is about what he was actually speaking of, astitva, the one's own, say, core identity. And he used a German term for it. He said das Ihn, D-A-S-E-I-N is how it is translated, das Ihn. And he wrote a work called Being and Time. This is the English translated title. In fact, all his works were written in German and then later translated to English. So in Being and Time, there is a time-based critique of the entire Western thought. So Professor Navjyoti Singh made a very important observation that the Western critique of European Enlightenment and the entire Western thought has focused only a critique of its temporal, in only the temporal dimension. That is to say, across times, how at all should one understand the way in which this thought unfolded? And it turns out that this, say, temporal critique if it were to be thought of to be a suitable critique for what happens to people who are experiencing the kind of forces that have come out of what we today call as Europe, or the capital West, capital W West, that thought sequence, whether it be in terms of the Greco-Roman thought, or the ones that also coupled with the Hebrew thought in the sense of the Abrahamic religions, the formulation of this, specifically if one takes the Greco-Roman thought which is actually presented, which indeed had, say, Greek thought as well as Hebrew thought in it, and a fusion of which has been spread across by the Romans, one would notice that the sense in which when it travels to some other place, it cannot see anything but itself wherever it goes. That is to say, the European Enlightenment and its claim to universality is limited by its spatial limitation, that it does not have the ability to adapt itself and serve the purpose of providing light to someone else who is at another point, at another spatial location, with that spatial location having their own, and people of that spatial location having their own past and their own understanding of how things have evolved over time. So, since whenever we speak about the way in which anything that has happened in the past, we do expect that, say, time and space are two different dimensions which require to be considered with sufficient kind of attention. The time-space, the critique based on time alone is insufficient, and a critique based on space is equally important for us to understand the kind of ills which the modern European Enlightenment and the kind of modernity which has been ushered in by it is causing. So for the biggest of it that we currently experience is that of the sense of climate change, and the kind of talk of, say, the kind of loss of connect between man and the environment, and the kind of separation that is made between man and environment. That is something that causes a great kind of a schism. So how at all, and it is not just limited to this, but whenever, say, one has to embrace what is actually offered, let's say like what happened during the British times, if one indeed embraces what the British offer, then the British also stated that you can do it only if you understand the way in which we have looked at your own past, and we have gifted you the history. Because the first time when this aggregate history got written was when James Mill wrote his work, History of British India. And the kind of, as I pointed out in the first session itself, the classification of periodization into the past when it comes to Indian history into Hindu period or a Muslim period and the British period, this kind of classification itself is something that was started by James Mill. And what we today have is, say, the removal of the Hindu-Muslim, and because they are thought to be communal and they're not thought to be, say, completely capturing the times in which we are speaking of, they have been changed to ancient and modern, ancient and medieval. So, and British turned out to be the advent of the modernity. Now, this kind of a periodization and this understanding has more or less completely obliterated the kind of memories that one would indeed have if at all one looks at one's own kind of stories that our own great-grandfathers or, say, great-great-grandfathers would have probably told about what's happening around in the society, because each person, as they actually live through an experience of a lifetime, they have their own sense of how things have unfolded in their lifetime, and they'll have a sense of it, and they'll have a description of the same in their own kinds of language and the categories of thought with which they look at the world. So do we have the memories of these in the light of this thing that happened because of the European Enlightenment, which is also a light which Dr. Ambedkar was seeing through, which indeed makes him look for the keys like Mullah did under the street light, and not for the kind of groping in the dark, which is probably required, because the kind of light that Europe shines on our own past isn't something that can be taken to that dark space. We might have to light our own kind of come up with our own light in order to say search through the dark space where the keys have been lost. This metaphorical understanding is something that, and this darkness that is created, in contrast to the term enlightenment, Professor Navjyoti used the term endarkenment, which I believe is one of the most significant kind of terms coined in terms of this type of understanding of our own past. So this is not something that Professor Navjyoti stopped with. He actually tried to also present a very categorical kind of classification as to why it is that European Enlightenment cannot have a light that can avoid causing darkness to people of other places, whether it be Arabia, whether it be India, whether it be China, or whether it be Japan. Why at all does it not have an ability to avoid this darkness that it causes? And here, Professor Navjyoti pointed out to a very insightful kind of a description, commentary found in Patanjali's Mahabhashya, Vyakarana Mahabhashya. So, Panini's Ashtadhyayi has around 4,000 odd sutras, of which one of the sutras says Bhuvadeyo Dhatavaha. So, in that sutra, there is a very extensive commentary that runs into probably, say, a few tens of pages. So, these few tens of pages in which, say, Patanjali has written his commentary, there is a very critical and very important kind of analysis that is done by Patanjali, and he asks a question in language. Here, of course, we are referring to Sanskrit, and one can indeed say, try and imagine it with respect to, say, other kind of languages also. The question posed is, what would be a Samanya Kriya? Samanya, as I have pointed out, is a jati, it's a universal. So when I say Samanya Kriya, the quest is for what is a universal verb. And why are we referring to verbs? Because human action is described by verbs. And whatever we actually get to notice in terms of the world that we live in, it is formed because of the nature of the deeds that people do, which are based on the conscious kind of actions that one wills and correspondingly does. And all these are different kinds described using verbs. So the question is, what is a Samanya Kriya? And what can be a Samanya Kriya? What are the candidates that can be a Samanya Kriya? And this is an analysis that Patanjali takes up. So what is a verb? So if you ask question, what do you do? The response that one gives to that question happens to be a verb, right? So what do you do? Let's say I'm playing, then playing is a verb there. So the formulation in this, in the nature of our own language and the manner in which we speak of this, a specific kind of a action that is done cannot be a universal verb because it is specific to that type of action only. So if one is speaking about what do you do, and for that you give a response, any response that comes to there, if at all it cannot actually describe all the other kind of actions that are possible, then we cannot possibly call it as a universal verb. In the Western thought, there has been a great kind of study, and in fact, in the 1970s, there has been a great degree of effort to try and analyze the entire Western thought in terms of the verb forms that are actually present in language. And in Greek thought, the verb to be, the being and the be forms, they are taken as the universal verb, and all the kind of Greek thought that one can actually say, imagine, whether it is already written or whether it is yet to be written, all of it is actually a deep reflection on the sense of the verb to be, or the sense of the verb being. So this is a key insight, which means to say that if one were to categorize the entire sense of Western thought, then it can be spoken of as an analysis that is based on the variety of reflections that one does on the variety of actions that are associated with the verb to be. And whenever one speaks of being, then that being, if I have to speak about my own being, then I must speak about both my body as well as the kind of things, my thoughts, my actions, my soul, all these are actually, say, involved in my being. There is, in the Western thought itself, there is a clear kind of a distinction that one makes with respect to what is a form and what is content. So any sense of a reference to being must necessarily be such that form and content are strongly coupled and they are inseparable. And this is a key point that one must keep in mind. So in terms of mathematics, when one looks at set theory, one cannot define a set without actually mentioning all the elements that are part of the set. When one refers to a proposition, which is a statement that comes in, that is the basis for all Western logic, that proposition cannot be described without actually giving the entire structure of subject and predicate. So this, say, structures which are actually at the core of the Western thought, that is, that takes its birth from Greek thought, they are actually such kind of formulations that are seen to be precisely the kind of reflections that come by reflecting on the sense of universal being, universal verb taken as to be. So by contrast, if one were to ask a question, what is it that the Sanskrit tradition states about this verb to be? So if one were to speak of it, I actually spoke of the term astitva, which is basically a universal about asti, which is a term which would be an appropriate translation of the word to be. So asti happens to be a verb, and this is one of the candidates that is discussed by Patanjali in his Mahabhashya on the commentary on the Sutra Bhuvadeyo Dhatavaha. And he considers three candidates for what could be a Samanya Kriya. They turned out to be asti, bhavati, and vidyate. So there is an analysis of these three verbs. I can go into that detail, but let me say, give you in brief that the claim is that asti, bhavati, vidyate. So vidyate is something that actually can be used only in such instances where a person is alive. It cannot be used in such instances which are dealing with, say, non-living things. So that way speaking, say, if a car is moving, then one cannot possibly have the vidyate as a universal verb which can have a collocation with the kind of action that a car does. So vidyate is ruled out, and what are left with us as candidates are asti and bhavati. And asti, as I already pointed out to you, is something that has been chosen by the Greeks, and the entire Greek reflection can be found in asti. And Patanjali makes a very simple assertion: nahi bhavati kim karoti asti iti. So if I ask you the question, what do you do? you would never answer, I am being. There is no sense in which that formulation ever comes in language, because that is not a proper response to the question of karoti, which is doing. So asti as a candidate is something that is also ruled out. And then the description moves on to understanding what would bhavati mean. And bhavati is a very important formulation that Patanjali extends this discussion and says that when it comes to, say, any type of a verb that is taken, if it can actually be collocated, that is to say, if you place in language bhavati, karoti together, that is, in a sentence, if you have bhavati, karoti, then such a kind of a thing is grammatically taken to be an appropriate kind of a placement. One cannot actually say that with asti karoti. Bhavati karoti has a meaning. And how is it that the meaning is actually acquired? This is where two devices are actually brought to the fore by Patanjali, and he speaks of bhava and bhava pratyaya. Ta and twa are bhava pratyayas, and bhava is something that is the sense in which. So if I say bhavati karoti, then the question that it indeed indicates is that in which sense of, in which bhava, in which sense, in which manner is the manner of doing that one is actually engaged in. Suppose you are, say, cooking, then question would be with which type of bhava are you doing it? Can be stated by bhavati pachati. So this collocation, which say is also spoken of in technical terms as samanadhikaranya, that is, you are actually placing them both together in the same locus. Such a kind of formulation indicates that the Sanskrit thought is something that reckoned bhavati as the universal verb and not asti. And an extension that Professor Navjyoti makes is very interesting. Buddhist thought is something that actually comes with this sense of bhavati in it. And therefore, if Buddhist thought goes to China, it becomes Chinese Buddhism. If it goes to Japan, it becomes Japanese Buddhism, by trying to adapt itself to the kind of content that is present. That is to say, the bhava pratyaya is what actually offers you with a possibility of separation between the form and the content. And the form can be something that can be taken anywhere across the space without trying to violate the content that a person might as well have inherited from their own past, which is not the case with that of the European thought. And this kind of a neat classification into two is a suggestion which Professor Navjyoti brings to our attention. And he says that the analytic universe of being requires to have a samskara performed by the analytic universe of bhavati, which is what the analysis that that our own collective ancestors have actually offered as a very critical observation in terms of what can actually be a samanya kriya, or that which can be a sense of universal verb. And this indeed brings us to the question, because we have actually spent good amount of time, including in Swarajan ideas, where Professor K.C. Bhattacharya has pointed out that Indians' desire for embracing the universal is something that goes beyond the kind of thing that one can possibly expect in other places. And when this universal turns out not to be a universal, but rather a pseudo-universal, or rather it is something that is incapable to be a universal, such a kind of a thing is what has resulted in the kind of state of our current affairs, of our own, say, state of confusion, where the sense of conflict hasn't yet come about. And the conscious knowledge of this categorical separation could possibly create such kind of analytic frameworks within which one can attempt to understand our own sense of our current times, our being in the present, and see what ought to be the nature of happenings with. So in fact, Professor Navjyoti translates this bhavati as a happening. So what kind of a happening, what kind of sense in which, say, the bhava with which one can think of the nature of actions and activities and the deeds that we can perform in the present. So this is something that calls for understanding about what would be the way in which the analytic universe of bhavati is to be properly understood. And the entire Shastras are actually, say, stated as the responses that are given to us as reflections based on the analytic universe of quote-unquote bhavati. So Dr. Ambedkar's critique, placing as it is by taking the universal verb to be, the analytic universe of being, is actually reading from a lens where it cannot capture the senses in which, say, these terms are being used, and the translation of these terms to language like English, or rather the choice of the meanings that are associated with it taken to be static and rather dead formulations, does not allow for a clarity about looking for a solution for the kind of challenges that Dr. Ambedkar indeed identifies. Like, for example, one of the reasons why Dr. Ambedkar's voice becomes a prominent voice when it comes to the making of the Constitution of India is because during the British times, there were a number of very self-respecting tribes and groups of jatis, which actually were so independent in their formulation that they were ready to fight to any extent to drive the British away. So what do the British do? They actually formulate a law where they categorize Dhils, who were very warrior type, and they always rebelled against the British authority. They have been labeled as criminal tribes. And what is it that is the way in which a criminal tribe needs to be treated? If you find a person who is belonging to a criminal tribe on the road, then the police is given the authority to arrest them without even, say, thinking twice whether they have actually done something worthy of being arrested or not. And these criminal tribes have been treated so very badly that they did not have any kind of a sense of a place in a society that is governed by the British law. So when India was aspiring for freedom, you had a number of tribes which were actually categorized as criminal tribes, and there is no discussion about what would freedom mean to them. Dr. Ambedkar also posed a question: what would freedom mean to those depressed classes overall, in terms of what change does it make to the life, the distressed life of these people who have been oppressed for so long? Because the conditions during the British rule have more or less altered the kind of senses in which they may have been present earlier. That poses a key question about what kind of a new possibility will this, say, seeking for freedom would offer one with. And these questions, if they are indeed to be read in the light of, say, the kind of questions that one were to think of Varnashrama Dharma as a dynamic entity, would call for, say, serious reflection, because such a kind of a thing did not happen even in the, say, last phases of the census that we find in the exact way in which things unfolded in the 1940s of the Common Era. There have been, say, some very insightful attempts made to try and critique this entire formulation of the West with Swarajan ideas. And this is something that I shared with you when I referred to Swami Karpateji's book, Marxwada Rama Rājya, which to my knowledge is probably the only text where there has been a critical study of the Western theories of polity and society and analyzing them in the light of Shastras. And this analysis also tried to point out what would be the Ramarajyavadin's approach as opposed to that of a Marxvada. And Marxvada includes, say, the capitalist formulation. So whenever the question of capitalism comes in, the key point that Swami Karpatriji points out is that capitalism cannot be without an appropriate regulatory framework, and dharma is that which provides such regulatory framework. And Marxvada identifies all the kinds of ills of capitalism and offers a solution to it, which is probably worse than the kind of problem that it is indeed trying to address. So there are certain good things that one finds in this kind of churning that took place in modern Europe while critiquing, say, what has happened in the past. And that critique, which is at the core of, say, the making of the modern polity, it requires to be taken with sufficient seriousness and must be juxtaposed with the kind of debates that happened within the, say, sense of how the polity and Rajaniti Shastra that is built in here, keeping, of course, in mind the sense in which Chaturvarnya and Varnashrama Dharma has been understood and adapted in practice during the times of, if not going very far back in time, during the times of Vijayanagara Empire, let's say the times of Sri Krishna Deva Raya, whose reign is supposedly, even to this day, recalled by many as something that belongs to a golden period that one could refer to. That kind of a thought itself is something that we find today is something that makes it difficult to articulate. And this is the amnesia that we have come to face. And the reason for amnesia, Professor Navjyoti pointed out, is on account of the embrace of a light, which is possibly something that can only cause darkness to one's own past. But if you leave aside one's own past and all the inheritances, then it will say, you can join us and you can embrace, say, what the West does, and you have a clear path to future. Now, this is a solution which cannot be acceptable to people who have a great past that is still, say, present, if not completely in memory, but certainly some parts of it. So what is it that one does after amnesia is a challenge that several thinkers in the past have tried to focus on. And this exercise of trying to think about Rama Rājya is our kind of a ticket to try and engage with such questions. And it is in that light that I wanted to bring a serious kind of attention to these thoughts, which can indeed make us, say, more clear about some of the very contemporary kind of analysis that are happening, whether it be in terms of the embrace of a uniform civil code that could possibly on the cards, given that our current Chief Justice of India recently made a reference to the Uniform Civil Code in Goa. So any kind of a uniform civil code would indeed mean that, say, there are definite kind of customs and practices that individual families would have to forego. And my understanding is that given the kind of society that we live in, social polity that we have, it still has very strong memories to respect the kind of things that happened in yore, because they see that that is founded on a sounder ground than what is being proposed. So even if, say, the Uniform Civil Code discussion should have the same kind of sanctity as the kind of sounder ground that common people would believe is present in, say, the kind of structures and the kind of thought processes which existed, which have stood the test of time over so many years. Even for that reason, it is important for us to actually consciously think of what is this sense of past that we have to, reconcile ourselves with, that which is inherited and that which is taught, and how do we harmonize the two. So with these words, I'd end this week's session on Sanatana as Nityanutana. And before I do that, I want to bring to your attention a very fine kind of a quotation from Professor K.C. Bhattacharya about the sense of what can be that which makes for a universal logic. So I am reading this aloud. Logic must be universal in the sense not only of presenting the form common to all that is claimed as knowledge, but also presenting form of all doubts and disputes. I'm pasting this for your reference. This also would get recorded. So this is from Professor Krishna Chandra Bhattacharya, whose Swaraj in Ideas has been one of the guiding lights for making up all that we have been discussing in this course. Why did I bring about this question of logic? Generally, people would think that, say, mathematics and logic are universal by nature. And I've already brought to your attention that the sense of Platonic logic and Aristotelian logic is different from Thomas Aquina's logic. And this kind of a thing was written in a fine book by Alastair McIntyre, whose title itself is Whose Justice, Which Rationality? So logic and rationality go together. So the sense of reasoning is something that is generally thought to be present only in the form of the proposition, and that form may not possibly capture all because it is rooted in the sense of this analytic universe of being. And how at all can we start reclaiming that sense of logic that is present in, let's say, Panini's Ashtadhyayi? I've actually brought to your attention that Panini's Ashtadhyayi has generic sutras, which are called as Utsarga Sutras, which are applicable in all general senses. And there are exception situations where these Utsarga Sutras do not hold and the exception rules hold. They are called as Apavada Sutras. The key question is that every society also has Utsarga Sutras and Apavada Sutras, just as in language. Whenever there is an attempt made to turn an Apavada Sutra in any given situation, an example of an Apavada Sutra is, say, the name Viśvamitra, sage Viśvamitra. If one were to split it into a sandhi, it becomes Vishva plus Amitra. And the Savarna Dirgha Sandhi is what is A plus A becomes A, makes it Viśvamitra. And it is categorically asserted that Savarna Dirgha Sandhi is not to be applied to the names of rishis. So Viśvamitra is an example of that exception. So whenever it comes to, say, the relative power between Utsarga Sutras and Apavada Sutras in the instance of an Apavada, that is the exception rule overrides the generic rule. So similarly, a society can also be imagined to have generic rules. Social polity has a generic rule as well as an exception rule. And wherever there is an instance of an exception, the exception overrides the generic rule. But that cannot ever mean that the exception itself can actually be made into a generic rule. Because if that happens, then it only means that, say, everything ought to be treated as an exception. And such a kind of a formulation is a direct kind of an embrace of what one would claim as the manner in which Buddhists have tried to speak of the presence of what is present in the world as only names, and everything is individual, and correspondingly an entire logic is set up. So that formulation would not possibly be something that one can claim as universal, because it is not giving you the forms of all the doubts and disputes that are actually also present in it. So with the conscious knowledge of, say, these kind of points, I believe that we need to look for that kind of a maryada which recognizes these generic rules and the exception rules. And if there's an attempt to make an exception as a generic rule, whether it is actually, in fact, such kind of a recognition itself requires one to create an atmosphere in society where one can indeed discuss it to recognize what is the importance of the generic rule. So these are questions that call for, say, further reflection, and these are the kind of things that we shall take up in the last session, final session of our course on sense of past towards realizing Rama Rājya. The session, the theme for the final two sessions is Sanatana Maryada, and at the same time, what can be the kind of way by which we can talk of a Sanmata Siddhanta. And this reference is something that comes from a specific kind of a play which was written by Jayanta Bhatta, one of the very famous Nayayikas of our times, of Prachina Nyaya. He was a minister in the court of Kashmir king. He lived about, say, 1,000+ years from now. He wrote a play called Sanmata Nataka. And there he speaks of several kinds of darshanas having debate amongst one another, and how at all should a king think of creating a kind of maryada that will respect everyone, to pursue their individual quests without any kind of a violation. And there's a very specific reference to Sankarya that is spoken of. That also is something that we'll try to see, and I do hope to share the PDF of Sanmata Nataka for reference before, say, the final sessions. So with this, I conclude this today's session, and if there are any questions, I'll be very glad to take. So if there are no questions, let me conclude with a short prayer unto Lord Rama. Apadam apahartaram, dataram sarvasampadam, lokabhiramam Sri Ramam, bhuyo bhuyo namamyaham.